was standing in the corner of the Lakeshore Gallery, pretending to be just another visitor. On the main wall hung a painting I knew by heart, The Light of Winter. Every brushstroke was mine, but beneath it was another name, Celia Grant, my former student. People applauded, cameras flashed, and I smiled quietly, because the truth was louder than any applause. They just didn't know it yet. I used to believe that Lakeshore would never change. It sat quietly by the lake, wrapped in fog each morning, its streets lined with wooden shops and easels leaning against windows. You could smell turpentine in the air, mixed with the scent of pine and fresh bread from Nora's cafe. To outsiders, Lakeshore looked like a postcard. To us, it was a sanctuary, a place where art didn't just hang on walls, it breathed. For more than 40 years, that little town had been my world. Every sunrise, I'd walk down the cobblestone path to the Lakeshore studio, where Samuel and I taught classes together. He was the kind of man who painted like he was listening to something sacred. When he laughed, the whole room felt brighter. I handled the theory, he handled the soul. And between us, somehow our students found their way to both. That was where I met Celia. She was only 21 when she first stepped through the door. Sharp eyes, restless hands, the sketchbook already half full of borrowed dreams. I remember how she looked at the light pouring in from the window, whispering, "It feels alive." Samuel smiled. "Then you're already halfway there." Celia stayed after class almost every day. She wanted to know everything. How to layer blue over ochre to make dawn feel colder. How to make a brush tremble just enough to paint grief without words. There was a hunger in her that frightened me, though I couldn't name it then. She painted like she was chasing something she might never catch. To her, Samuel and I were more than teachers. We were family, or at least that's what I let myself believe. She brought us flowers on our birthdays, made tea when we stayed too late at the studio, and sometimes fell asleep in the corner with charcoal still on her fingers. I used to cover her with Samuel's old coat. "She's got a fire," he said once, watching her sleep. But fire doesn't always know what it burns. Years passed like seasons, and then one winter morning Samuel was gone. A heart attack, sudden and cruel. The studio felt hollow without his voice echoing off the canvases. His easel remained untouched for weeks, the last brush still wet with paint that would never dry. I tried to keep teaching, but every lesson felt unfinished. Celia came less often. When she did, her tone had changed, sharper, impatient. "Marianne, people don't want old stories anymore," she said one day. "They want something bold, something they've never seen." I looked at her painting. All red and black, no breath left for quiet. "Bold doesn't mean loud," I told her. "Sometimes silence is the bravest color." She smiled politely, the kind of smile that ends conversations. After that, she stopped calling. Months later, her name started appearing in magazines. Celia Grant, the new face of modern light. The photo showed her in front of a canvas that felt familiar. First, I thought I was mistaken. Many artists paint the lake, the morning frost, the pale sunlight caught between water and air. But then I saw it, the faint outline of Samuel's signature composition, the same curve of the shoreline we painted 100 times together. The title read, "The Light of Winter." Every brushstroke, every gradient of white, they were mine. Ours. My hand shook. I turned off the screen, but the image burned in my mind. She had taken it. Not the painting, but the memory of how it was born. The laughter, the lessons, the mornings when Samuel and I taught her what light meant. She took all of it and sold it for fame. That night, I sat in the dark studio surrounded by old canvases. The clock ticked softly, the sound of years slipping away. I thought of confronting her. I thought of letters, lawyers, even public shame. But none of those felt right. Because this wasn't about ownership. It was about truth. Samuel once told me, "You can't teach morality through words, only through consequence." So I decided to wait. Lakeshore carried on as if nothing had happened. Tourists came, applauded Celia's name, took pictures with her paintings. They called her a genius. I stood among them once, just another face in the crowd, and listened to people praise the glow in the light of winter. They didn't know that the glow came from my brush, from years of learning to see beauty in the quiet. I went home that night and opened an old drawer. Inside was a single unfinished sketch, Samuel's last one. The same composition Celia had used, only softer, humbler. Next to it lay a note in his handwriting. Art only lives when truth does. I pressed the note to my chest and smiled for the first time in months. If justice couldn't be bought with words, then I'd let truth find its own way back. Not through anger but through silence. Because silence, when held with dignity, speaks in ways applause never can. And so while Celia's name echoed through the galleries of the world, I picked up my old brush once more, the one she'd forgotten I still owned, and began to paint again. Not for fame, not for revenge, but to remind myself that light once found can never truly be stolen. The studio smelled of dust and turpentine the morning I went back. It had been years since I'd opened that door. The air was still, as if waiting for me to speak first. I brushed my fingers along the windowsill and felt the fine grit of time. The light fell through the curtains just the way it used to when Samuel was alive. That kind of light that made even dust look holy. In the corner, half buried under a tarp, stood an old wooden crate. His crate. Samuel never threw anything away. Inside were broken jars, a cracked palette, and one brush, the long-handled sable he used until the bristles split in half. I lifted it carefully. The wood had darkened, and the handle was fractured right through the middle. I remembered the day it broke. He'd been working on the light of winter. He pressed too hard on the canvas and the handle snapped. He laughed and said, "Well, maybe that's how God reminds us to loosen our grip." I told him to throw it away, but he kept it, wrapping a strip of linen around the crack. "Someday," he said, "someone will understand what this brush taught me, that broken things can still finish the masterpiece." Holding it now, the weight felt different. Lighter, lonelier. I placed it on the table and noticed a thin layer of dust clinging to the floorboards beneath. When I swept it aside, I found a sketchbook, brown leather, the edges curled. My breath caught. It was Samuel's. I untied the string, and there it was, the first drafts of The Light of Winter. He had written notes beside each drawing, little arrows pointing to the horizon line, the subtle gradation of white and gold. His handwriting was firm, patient. In one corner a smudge of blue, the same pigment we mixed together that last winter. I turned each page slowly, and with every stroke I saw my own hands, my own lessons. The same composition Celia had displayed in her gallery, identical, even to the way Samuel signed the initials SC at the bottom. She hadn't even changed them. She'd only traced. It hit me like cold water. Celia hadn't just borrowed inspiration. She had taken the soul of a moment that wasn't hers. The laughter, the teaching, the way Samuel looked at the lake that morning and whispered, "It glows because it forgives the darkness." I closed the book and sat on the stool, the broken brush still resting beside me. If Samuel were here, what would he say? Maybe he'd smile, the same quiet smile that made his eyes soften. Maybe he'd remind me that art isn't about revenge, that real artists don't expose the thief. They reveal the truth through creation. And maybe if he hadn't left, none of this would have happened. If he were still here, Celia might have stayed humble, still seeking guidance instead of glory. He always had a way of disarming people with kindness, the kind that makes you see your reflection clearer. But he was gone, and in his absence ambition had grown wild, like vines crawling over the walls of our old studio. I ran my fingers along the sketch again. The pencil lines trembled with a familiarity that hurt. I could almost hear Samuel's voice behind me. "Don't waste your anger, Marianne. Turn it into light. Let them see themselves by what you create next." I whispered back, "Then teach me one more time." Outside, the wind moved across the lake. The water shimmered with that same pale winter glow we once tried to capture. And I realized maybe that was his answer. Justice wouldn't come from a courtroom or an argument. It would come from patience, from allowing the truth to surface the way light rises after fog. I took the broken brush in my hand. The linen wrapping was loose, almost falling apart, but it still held. I dipped it in a jar of clear water, watched the bristles fan open, and smiled. If he could still paint through this broken handle, then so could I. If Celia had stolen the light of winter, then I would teach her what light truly was, not with anger but with grace. Because the worst punishment for a lie is not exposure. It's the moment the liar sees the truth reflected back at them. That night I locked the studio again. But this time I didn't feel grief when I turned the key. I felt something else: resolve. Samuel once told me, a true artist never avenges, she enlightens. And I knew then, my lesson to Celia would begin not with words but with silence. When I walked past the Lakeshore Gallery that morning, I didn't plan to step inside. But the sign on the door caught my eye: help needed. Assistant for cleaning and framing. The words looked harmless, almost ordinary, yet they pulled at something inside me. I stood there for a long time, staring at my own reflection in the glass. Behind it, I could see the faint outline of the light of winter hanging under another name, Celia Grant. The same brushstrokes, the same silence in the snow. And for a moment I felt like a ghost, watching my own soul displayed for sale. So I walked in. The young clerk didn't recognize me. She smiled politely and said, "Mrs. May, right? Miss Grant will be thrilled to have help before the next exhibition." Mrs. May. That was the name I gave them. It was Samuel's mother's maiden name. Simple, invisible, safe. That's how I returned to the world Celia had built. Not as her teacher. Not as the woman she betrayed. But as the old cleaning lady sweeping the dust beneath her fame. Every morning I arrived before the lights came on. I wiped the frames of the paintings I once inspired, polished the glass, and mopped the marble floors until they shone like mirrors. Each day I stood inches away from my own past, from colors that had once lived under my hands, now carrying someone else's signature. Sometimes when no one was watching, I'd stop in front of the light of winter. People always said the painting was radiant, but I could see where the light had been forced, where the warmth was faked. Real light never screams. It whispers. But I stayed silent too. Celia would come in around noon, all smiles and perfume, followed by assistants with cameras. She'd walk past me without looking twice. "Mrs. May, could you dust the corner near the east wall?" Her voice was gentle, efficient, the kind she must have practiced in interviews. And I would nod. "Of course, ma'am." There was a strange kind of peace in pretending to be invisible, because in that invisibility I could finally see everything. How success had hardened her smile. How exhaustion hid beneath the shimmer of her lipstick. How the gallery, for all its brightness, had no warmth at all. One evening, long after everyone had left, I stayed behind. The moonlight through the glass ceiling painted thin silver lines across the floor. In the storage room I found an old trunk labeled Archive Lakeshore Studio. My hands trembled when I opened it. Inside were forgotten sketches, some of Samuel's, some of mine, and a few of Celia's early works. At the bottom, wrapped in brown paper, was a drawing I didn't expect to see again. The Light of Winter original study. The lines were faint, smudged by years of neglect, but still alive. It was the blueprint she had copied. I sat down on the cold floor and unfolded my own worn sketchbook beside it. The difference was quiet but undeniable. Mine had soul. Hers had ambition. For hours I stared between the two, and for the first time I didn't feel angry. I just felt tired. Tired of noise, of proving, of waiting for apologies that never came. That's when Samuel's voice returned to me, clear as if he were sitting right beside me. "Don't rescue someone from their own blindness, Marianne. Let them bump into the light." It was something he used to say when our students made mistakes, not to embarrass them, but to let them discover truth on their own. And suddenly I understood what he meant. Love, even wise love, has its limits. There comes a point when helping becomes enabling. When mercy without truth turns into permission for wrong. People often confuse silence with surrender, but silence can also be discipline. It's the decision to let time be the teacher. So that night I didn't burn her copies. I didn't confront her or call a lawyer. I simply opened my sketchbook, took out my brush and began again. I started to repaint the light of winter from memory. But this time I painted it differently. The lake was softer. The sky carried a pale, forgiving blue. And instead of the sun breaking through the clouds, I painted its reflection, faint, gentle, the way Samuel used to see it. Each stroke felt like an apology, not to Celia but to him. To the man who believed in art as redemption. To the teacher who never sought justice, only truth. By dawn the painting was half finished. My hands were sore, my heart strangely calm. The light in my version didn't dazzle. It breathed. And when I stepped back, I realized it wasn't the light of winter anymore. It was something else. Something purer. A love letter disguised as a lesson. A goodbye disguised as grace. The next morning when Celia entered the gallery and walked past me again, I smiled. She didn't notice, of course. But for the first time I didn't need her to. Because I finally understood. Justice isn't always about exposing what was stolen. Sometimes it's about creating something no one can ever steal again. The cafe next to the gallery was always filled with the smell of roasted beans and quiet chatter. I used to go there after cleaning the exhibition hall, just to rest my back and drink something warm before walking home. That's where I first met Nora Fields. She was about my daughter's age, with kind eyes that seemed to notice everything people tried to hide. She owned the cafe herself. Every morning she'd set out 2 vases of lilies by the window, one on each side, as if balancing the room between beauty and silence. The first time she spoke to me, I was wiping the counter near the sugar stand. "You're from the gallery, right?" she asked. "Yes," I said softly, "just helping out with cleaning." She smiled. "You have the hands of someone who used to paint." I froze. No one had ever said that to me since I came back to Lakeshire. From that day, she began saving me a seat by the window. We'd talk between her rush hours, about weather, coffee, and art that neither of us could afford to buy. She was curious but never nosy. She had that rare gift of listening without interrupting, like someone who knew how much a person could carry in silence. One afternoon, while wiping tables, she looked toward the gallery. "Funny, isn't it?" she said. "That place used to belong to a woman named Marianne Cole. My mom took classes there when she was young. She said Mrs. Cole taught her how to paint sunlight, not just objects." Her words hit me like a quiet storm. I looked down at my cup, afraid she'd see the truth on my face. "What happened to her?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Nora shrugged. "No one knows. I heard she disappeared after her partner passed. Some say she moved away. Others say she just stopped painting." I wanted to tell her everything, the betrayal, the silence, the name I had buried under dust. But the words never came. Instead I smiled and said maybe she just wanted peace. Nora nodded. "Maybe. But if she was still here, she'd hate what they've done to that gallery. Feels hollow. Beautiful but hollow." There was a pause. Then she looked straight at me. "You know, Mrs. May, you remind me of her." I didn't answer. But that night I couldn't sleep. The past had found me again, through the voice of a stranger pouring coffee. Over the following weeks, Nora and I grew closer. Sometimes after closing time, she'd bring me leftover pastries and ask me about art. "Why do people paint?" she once asked. "To remember what the world looked like before it hurt them," I said. She smiled faintly. "That sounds like something a teacher would say." One rainy evening, she came rushing into the gallery before closing. "Mrs. May," she whispered, "I saw an old article about the real artist behind the light of winter. It mentioned Samuel and his student Marianne Cole. That's you, isn't it?" Her voice wasn't accusing. It was trembling, like she had stumbled onto something sacred. I didn't deny it. I just looked at the floor. She set her umbrella down, her expression gentle but firm. You don't have to hide from it anymore, she said. I've seen you looking at those paintings. The way you clean them. It's like you're touching someone you loved. Tears rose before I could stop them. She was my student, I whispered. Celia. I taught her everything I knew. When Samuel died, I tried to guide her alone. But ambition, it changes the way people see light. Nora nodded slowly. And yet, you never told anyone. What good would it do? I asked. The truth shouted too soon only makes people cover their ears. Sometimes you have to wait until they're ready to hear it. She leaned back thoughtful. My mother used to say, don't argue with people who live on applause. Let the echo teach them who's clapping. I smiled. Your mother was a wise woman. She like you, Nora said. You both believe silence can speak. After that, Nora became more than a friend. She became a witness. She never told a soul, but she began watching closely. How Celia talked about art that wasn't hers. How the paintings in the gallery carried too much polish and too little heart. One afternoon, she said something I'll never forget. Maybe justice isn't always about proving who's wrong. Maybe it's about letting time reveal who's true. Her words settled deep inside me. They reminded me of Samuel's calm voice, of all the mornings we spent teaching students how to paint honesty, not perfection. And that's when I realized I wasn't alone anymore. Someone else saw the difference between imitation and truth. Sometimes the smallest witness can become the loudest conscience. And sometimes the quietest friendship becomes the turning point of a lifetime. The week Nora started helping Celia with her new exhibition contract, the gallery was brighter than usual. She'd been invited to assist with the paperwork. Celia trusted her for her precision, and Nora, ever gentle, agreed. I kept cleaning near the back, pretending to polish frames while listening from the corner. They spread the papers out on the front table. The air smelled like fresh ink and ambition. Celia was signing her name with the same care she once used to blend colors. Slow, controlled, certain. Nora read aloud each line before moving on. International exhibit rights. Distribution license. Artist ownership clause. When Celia reached the last page, she sighed. Finally. After this, I'll be more than Lakeshire's darling. I'll be known everywhere. Her voice carried a pride I once mistook for promise. But as she signed, I noticed something small, something only a person used to reading Samuel's meticulous notes would catch. The date. Celia wrote the wrong year. The careless mistake may be one number off, but in a legal contract, that single digit was everything. It meant the document's start date came before the registration of her new collection. In law, that meant no protection at all. She had just voided her own rights. I stood still, cloth in hand, watching the pen glide across paper. For a second I wanted to stop her, to tell her to check again, to look closer. But then I heard Samuel's words echo softly in my mind. Let truth reveal itself. Don't rush to correct the lesson meant to be learned. So I stayed silent. When they finished, Celia pushed the papers toward Nora. Can these please? Send a copy to the agent tonight. Nora nodded, gathering the sheets carefully. She didn't notice. No one did. That evening, after everyone left, I returned to the office to tidy up. The contract was still on the desk, half inside its folder. The moonlight slid across the surface, highlighting the wrong date again. I hesitated, then took out my phone and snapped a quiet picture. The flash was off, my hand steady. I wasn't collecting evidence out of malice. It was instinct, like saving a piece of truth before it vanished. When I put the papers back, I noticed my reflection in the glass. I didn't look like a teacher or an artist, just an old woman cleaning up after someone else's dream. But behind that reflection I saw something else, justice taking shape, slowly, like light beneath a closed curtain. The next morning, Nora handed Celia a digital copy. You'll need this for your registration, she said. Celia smiled, too busy checking her phone to respond properly. She didn't know her signature had already undone itself. Days passed. The gallery buzzed with plans for the overseas exhibition. Sponsors called. Invitations printed. And I kept mopping the same floor, my secret safe inside the phone I never used. Sometimes I asked myself if staying silent made me complicit. But every time that thought surfaced, I remembered how Samuel used to talk about truth. It doesn't need a champion, Marianne. It only needs space to stand. That's what I was giving it, space. A few nights later, Nora stopped by the storage room to chat while I organized supplies. Celia's exhausted, she said. She's been up all night dealing with the contracts. I smiled faintly. Success can be heavy, can't it? Nora nodded. Still, I wish she'd slow down. There's something about her that feels rushed. Like she's always running ahead of herself. I wanted to tell her she was right. That Celia had already run past the edge without seeing it. But wisdom, I've learned, sometimes means knowing when to let silence teach. Later that week, I printed the copy I'd saved and folded it into a brown envelope. On the front I wrote one line. Keep this. Time may need it more than you do. I left it hidden inside the drawer beneath my sketchbook. No one would find it until they had to. Justice doesn't always arrive in a courtroom. Sometimes it walks quietly behind arrogance, waiting for it to trip. When I left the gallery that night, the sky over Lakeshore was soft and clear. The lake reflected the lights from the town like a page covered in faint brushstrokes. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the cool air, realizing how peace can exist even when fairness hasn't yet. Because peace comes when you trust that truth will finish the painting you started. No matter who tried to sign their name over it, the gallery was busier than I'd ever seen it. Boxes stacked by the door. Assistants running back and forth with gloves and clipboards. Celia stood in the middle, giving orders with that bright, polished voice people believed was confidence. Her new collection was called New Lights. Ironically, the sketches were old. Fragments of Samuel's lessons, fragments of mine. She'd taken what was meant to be guidance and turned it into spectacle. Mrs. May, she called to me. Could you check the frames for the winter series? I don't want any dust showing under the lights. Yes, ma'am, I said, bowing my head slightly. It was strange taking orders from someone who once called me mentor. But I'd learned that silence sometimes carries more power than protest. While I wiped the glass, I noticed something small taped to the back of one of her paintings. The sketch, barely visible, that matched the one in my old journal. The same faint pencil curve. The same mark Samuel used to sign his drafts. I traced it gently with my fingertips. It wasn't anger I felt, just the sharp sting of déjà vu. Like watching a song you wrote being sung with someone else's name beneath the melody. That evening, after the others left, Nora came by with coffee. She placed the cup near me and whispered, "They've been printing invitations all day. The press release calls her the voice of modern light." I smiled faintly. Light doesn't belong to anyone, Nora. It only reveals who's standing under it. She hesitated. What are you going to do? I looked at the painting again. Nothing loud. 2 days later, while Celia rehearsed her speech for the exhibition opening, I sat at my old desk with a different purpose. I took out the Light of Winter original sketch. It still smelled faintly of graphite and cedar. Samuel's handwriting curled along the edge. Truth needs no signature. I packed it carefully, slid a small note inside, and sealed it in an envelope addressed to the Lakeshire Art Council. The note said, "For archival comparison, to preserve authenticity, no accusation, no demand, just truth sent quietly where it belonged." I mailed it that afternoon, then went back to sweeping the gallery floors. By the time the opening night arrived, the invitation list had grown longer than the tables that would hold the champagne. Guests in velvet coats and silver jewelry filled the room. Cameras flashed. Critics whispered words like visionary evolution, modern rebirth. And in the center stood Celia, radiant in her white dress, her voice trembling slightly as she said, This collection is dedicated to my mentors, who taught me that light is meant to be shared. The crowd applauded. I watched her smile widen, the kind that only looks steady until truth begins to move beneath it. The next morning, the council's letter arrived at the gallery. It wasn't addressed to Celia. It was marked to the curator's attention. The envelope was thick, official. Nora was there when the courier handed it over. Celia tore it open in front of everyone. Her expression changed almost instantly. The letter thanked her for her submission and attached a printed comparison between New Lights No. 1 and the archive sketch of The Light of Winter. 2 images side by side. Identical composition, identical brush direction. Only one difference, the signature at the bottom. People murmured. Someone from the staff leaned closer, whispering, "That can't be right." "Can it?" Celia laughed nervously. "There must be a mistake. I use my own drafts." But even as she spoke, her hands trembled. I stood quietly by the wall, holding a duster I no longer needed. Nora looked at me. She didn't say a word. Neither did I. By evening, the questions had spread online. Critics who once praised her began asking where her inspiration came from. The council requested further documentation. The sponsors asked for clarity before the international shipment. Celia's world, built on applause, began to flicker. Not collapse, not yet. Just flicker. Like a light bulb about to reveal what's beneath the glow. I returned home late that night. On my kitchen table, the spare copy of the sketch lay open, smudged by my hands. I traced the faint line where Samuel's initials once were and thought, this isn't revenge. This is restoration. Some people mistake exposure for cruelty. But truth, when timed right, isn't cruelty at all. It's the moment a mirror finally clears. Before going to bed, I looked out my window toward the gallery's direction. The lights were still on, but softer now. I wondered if she was standing there alone, staring at her reflection in the glass the way I once had. And for the first time in years, I whispered aloud, "May she finally see what light really looks like." Because the truth had begun to surface. Not through noise, but through silence that refused to disappear. The night of the opening arrived like a storm disguised in velvet. Every artist, critic, and collector in Lakeshire gathered under the gold lights of the gallery. The banners read "New Lights, a celebration of modern vision." Celia stood in front, glowing under the cameras, her voice confident, her smile steady. I stood in the back, still wearing the plain black uniform of the gallery assistant. To most people, I was invisible. It was a gift I had learned to value. The air smelled of champagne and new paint. Every wall shimmered with her canvases, brighter, larger, louder versions of something I once called truth. When the speeches ended, Celia gestured toward the centerpiece. "This," she said, "is The Light of Winter reimagined. My most personal work." Applause filled the room. Flashbulbs exploded. Then the curator cleared his throat. "Before we continue, we have a surprise addition from the Lakeshire Art Council. A rare archival piece, submitted anonymously, for comparison and preservation." The assistants wheeled out another canvas, covered in white cloth. My heartbeat slowed as if the world itself was inhaling. When the cloth was pulled away, silence fell. 2 paintings. Same composition. Same colors. Same soul. But only one carried the quiet imperfection of human memory. The softness in the snow, the faint warmth under cold light. Mine. Celia's hand trembled on the microphone. This must be some mistake." Her voice cracked slightly, but she tried to smile through it. I stepped forward slowly, carefully. My voice was steady. "No mistake. One of these was painted from sight, the other from memory." People turned to look at me. Some whispered. The few recognized me from old newspaper photos, the mentor she once spoke about but never named. Celia's eyes widened. "You?" I nodded gently. "You painted what you saw. I painted what I lived." The curator frowned, confused. Nora, who stood near the council table, raised a folder in her hand. "This came with the submission," she said. Her voice was calm, almost protective. "It includes Samuel Reed's original certificate of authenticity. His handwriting, his date, his sketch notes. All registered under Marianne Cole." The room froze. The journalists lowered their cameras. For once, no one wanted a picture, they wanted understanding. Celia's breathing grew shallow. "I didn't know. I didn't mean." Her words tangled between guilt and pride. I looked at her, not with anger but with recognition. Samuel used to say, "Light reveals, but it also blinds if you stare too long." You were blinded by what you thought success looked like. Tears welled in her eyes. "I just wanted to matter." I whispered, "You did. You always did. But you tried to borrow light instead of building your own." Someone in the audience gasped quietly. Others turned away, ashamed of their applause from before. The gallery had no sound now, just the echo of breathing, of realization, of something breaking open inside everyone present. Celia stepped closer to the two paintings, her reflection caught between them on the glass. "Which one do you think they'll remember?" she asked, almost childlike. I smiled faintly. "Both. One is truth. One is a lesson." Then I turned to the audience. The painting doesn't just capture what's seen. It holds the moment the artist understood something. One of these was born of light, the other of understanding. No one applauded. They didn't need to, because some truths are too heavy for clapping. Nora placed her hand gently on Celia's shoulder. "Art isn't about ownership," she said softly. "It's about integrity." Celia's knees weakened. Integrity can't be painted over. The brush of her dress against the floor sounded like surrender. She didn't collapse because of humiliation, but because she finally saw the line between talent and honesty, and how easily she had crossed it. I wanted to comfort her, but I didn't move. Growth sometimes requires distance. She looked up, eyes red, and whispered, "I stole your light." I shook my head. "No. You just forgot where it came from." In that moment the tension broke. Not with noise but with stillness. That's how truth works. It doesn't shout. It settles. When I left the stage, the crowd parted silently. Nora followed me to the door, whispering, "You could have destroyed her." "I didn't need to," I said. "Truth already did the work." Outside, the winter air was crisp. I looked up at the sky, remembering Samuel's favorite phrase. Some lessons are painted not in color, but in consequence. That night I didn't feel victorious. I just felt free. Because for the first time in years I didn't have to prove where my light came from. It had proven itself. By morning every headline carried her name. Not as a rising star, not as the prodigy she wanted to be remembered as, but as the artist who copied her mentor. Reporters crowded the gallery steps. Flashlights burst like silent thunder. Celia stood behind the locked glass doors, her reflection multiplied by every camera lens outside. Each question thrown at her was the same, only phrased differently. "Did you know it was stolen? Will you apologize publicly? Are you returning the award money?" She didn't answer. Maybe she couldn't. Her voice, the one that once filled galleries with confidence, was gone. I watched from across the street, my coat buttoned tight against the wind. Nora stood beside me, holding 2 cups of coffee. "She looks smaller," she whispered. "She's finally seeing herself," I said quietly. When pride breaks, it never makes a sound. It simply collapses inward. By afternoon, the sponsors withdrew their contracts. The museum canceled her upcoming show in Vienna. Her name disappeared from their posters as if it had never existed. Only the faint outline remained, like a ghost watermark behind success that came too fast. I didn't celebrate. I didn't speak. People expected me to make a statement, to appear on camera and confirm the truth. But silence can be louder than any interview. Silence makes people listen to what they already know but don't want to admit. Nora looked at me. "You're not going to say anything?" I shook my head. "No. The world doesn't need another speech about honesty. They just need to see what happens when it's ignored. That night I walked past the gallery again. The lights were off except for one, her office window upstairs. Celia sat there alone, head bowed over her desk. The same desk where she once signed her forged name in silver ink. Now it was covered in torn letters, unpaid invoices, and a single brush lying across the pile untouched. I thought about going in, about saying something kind, but kindness, when given too early, can steal the lesson pain was trying to teach. I turned away. The reflection of her face in the glass stayed behind me like a haunting. In the following days her friends vanished too. The ones who used to call her visionary stopped answering. Her social media went dark. The gallery that bore her name changed ownership within a week. Still I said nothing. When Nora asked why, I told her, because no accusation is stronger than the silence of someone who once loved you. And I meant it. Silence forces the guilty to hear their own echoes. It's the kind of justice time delivers gently, but relentlessly. A week later a letter arrived at my door. No return address, just my name written in a shaky hand. Inside was a check, every cent she had earned from the light of winter. And a single note. I wanted the world to see me, but I forgot who taught me to see. I didn't cash the check. I placed it in Samuel's old sketchbook instead. He would have smiled, I think. Not in triumph but in peace. That night I returned to the lake. The wind carried the sound of distant church bells across the water. For the first time in years, I felt a quiet kind of mercy settle inside me. Pride, I realized, is the easiest thing to build and the hardest thing to survive once it falls. And love, real love, doesn't need to remind the world of its pain. It just waits patiently until the noise fades. When I looked back at the darkened town, I could almost hear Samuel's voice again. Light doesn't punish, Marianne. It reveals. And somewhere in that revelation Celia was learning to see. The morning mist curled gently over the lake, soft as breath on glass. I hadn't been back here in months. The air smelled of pine and paint, the two things that had built my whole life. The group of children waited near the old wooden pier, their sketchbooks pressed to their chests, eyes wide and expectant. Nora had organized the little art class herself. She said the town needed something quiet again, something good. I brought a tin box of pencils and a stack of blank paper. No speeches, no lessons written down, just space to see. "Do we draw the water, Mrs. Cole?" one boy asked. I smiled. "No," I said softly. "You draw what the water makes you feel." They looked at me, puzzled but curious. That was enough. As they started sketching, I sat by the edge of the dock. The sun was rising, its light turning the surface of the lake into liquid silver. I watched it stretch across the ripples, the same light I'd spent my whole career chasing on canvas. For years I believed I had to own that light, that only through control could I honor it. But now, watching those children laugh as their pencils stumbled and danced, I understood. Light never belonged to me. It never belonged to anyone. It only ever wanted to be seen. One of the girls held up her page. "Is it good?" she asked. The lines were uneven, the proportions off. But in the center she captured something. A shimmer, the movement of light that wasn't copied from sight, but felt from within. "It's perfect," I said. "Because it's honest." Honesty. That was what Samuel had always taught, what Celia had once forgotten, and what I had almost lost in the noise of proving myself. The lake breeze brushed against my hands. My knuckles had stiffened over the years, the bones more visible than before. I looked down at them, these hands that had painted every season of my life, hands that had held anger, love, pride, regret, and now peace. Behind me, Nora was helping the smallest child hold her brush steady. Their laughter carried across the water. For a brief moment it sounded like music, quiet, human, unrepeatable. I dipped my brush into a cup of lake water, just to feel its coolness again. The reflection on the surface shimmered. The same as in the light of winter. Only this time it didn't hurt to look. The children gathered around me, curious. "What are you painting, Mrs. Cole?" I smiled. "Nothing new. Just the morning." They leaned closer, watching as the paper soaked up faint washes of gold and gray. Every stroke was slower, gentler, unafraid of imperfection. Once I painted to be remembered. Now I painted to remember. Across the lake, the church bell rang 9 times. The heron took flight, its wings brushing the mist. I thought about Celia, where she might be, what she might be learning in the silence she had to face. I didn't wish her pain, only understanding, because that's the real justice art offers, the chance to see ourselves clearly, even when it hurts. The boy beside me whispered, "It's so quiet here." I nodded. Quiet helps the truth speak. He didn't understand then, but someday he would. When class ended, the children packed their things and ran up the hill toward the town. Their laughter echoed between the trees like small bells. I stayed behind, cleaning the brushes one by one. Each stroke through the water erased a little more of what I used to be. And when I stood up, the sunlight caught the lake just right. The same light from my painting. The same light from my memories. Only now it wasn't mine to capture, it was mine to live inside. I smiled, not because I'd won anything but because I'd finally stopped fighting. The light no longer needed my name. It was enough to know I had found my way back to it. The knock came just after dawn. Soft, uncertain, the kind of sound that carries hesitation more than intent. I was cleaning brushes in the studio when I heard it. The lake outside was still covered in mist, the kind that makes everything look half-remembered. I opened the door and there she was, Celia. She looked smaller than I remembered. The sharpness that once defined her, her walk, her words, her confidence was gone. In her hands, wrapped carefully in a cloth, was something long and thin. "May I come in?" she asked. Her voice trembled the way old glass does when you tap it. Fragile but not yet broken. I stepped aside without a word. For a long time we stood in silence. The air between us was full of things unsaid. Years of admiration, betrayal, shame, and somewhere underneath it all, love. Finally she unwrapped the cloth. Inside was the broken brush, Samuel's brush, the one I'd thought was lost forever. The wood had splintered near the handle, but it was clean, oiled, cared for. "I kept it," she whispered. I don't even know why. Maybe because I thought if I held on to it long enough, I could pretend the good parts of me weren't gone. I said nothing. Silence, I've learned, is sometimes the only honest language left between two people who've hurt each other. She placed the brush on my desk, next to my sketches. Her hands lingered there. "I used the light to lie," she said quietly, eyes fixed on the lake through the window. "But it burns differently in me now. I can't see it the same way anymore." There was no accusation in her words, just exhaustion. The woman standing at the edge of what she once believed she deserved. I looked at her, really looked, at the lines on her face, the faint gray in her hair, the way her shoulders curved inward like someone who'd been carrying too much truth for too long. "Strange," I finally said, "how the same light can both blind us and lead us home." Her eyes met mine then, wet, unguarded, human. For the first time since the trial I saw the student I once loved to teach. "Samuel used to say," she murmured, "we paint to understand, not to impress." I forgot that. I thought the world would only see me if I shouted loud enough. I smiled faintly. "And now?" "Now," she said, "I think the world only sees clearly when we finally go quiet." The room filled with that kind of silence that feels alive, pulsing, sacred. No apologies. No forgiveness. Just two people standing in the truth they'd both avoided. The broken brush lay between us like a small, beautiful confession. Outside, the morning light shifted across the water. Celia stepped closer to the window. "It's the same light, isn't it?" "Yes," I said. "But it doesn't belong to either of us anymore." She nodded, and for a moment she almost smiled. It wasn't the smile of someone forgiven, but of someone freed. When she turned to leave, she paused at the door. "I'm starting over," she said softly. "Not to prove anything this time, just to learn how to see again." I wanted to say something, anything, but words felt too heavy for what that moment already carried. So I simply nodded. As she walked down the stone path toward the lake, the mist began to lift. For a second, the sunlight caught her hair and turned it gold. The same light that once exposed her now seemed to embrace her. When she disappeared beyond the trees, I sat back at my desk, staring at Samuel's brush. It was broken, yes, but not useless. Some things are never meant to be fixed. They're meant to remind us of where we split, and how we kept painting anyway. I picked it up, tracing the cracks along the handle. My hands no longer trembled. Outside, the lake was calm. The world at last was quiet. And in that silence I realized, forgiveness doesn't need to be spoken, just needs to be seen. The gallery was quiet that evening, too quiet for an opening. People moved gently between the paintings, speaking in low tones as if they were in a cathedral. It was my final exhibition. My hands trembled slightly as I adjusted the frame of the last piece. The silent canvas. It looked simple from the front, muted tones of cream and gray. The faint shimmer of light caught between layers of varnish. But I knew what lay beneath. Behind that paint was a secret. A letter, sealed in the place where color meets silence. Nora stood beside me holding a small program. "You really named it that?" she asked. I nodded. "It's not the painting that matters this time," I said. "It's what it hides." She smiled softly, but her eyes glistened. "You always did have a strange way of telling the truth." Guests began to gather around, curious about the piece. Some recognized my older works. Others whispered, "She's the woman who exposed her own student." But I didn't hear accusation in their tone, only understanding. Time had softened the story. A young reporter approached. "Mrs. Cole, may we ask, what makes this your last?" I looked at the canvas, because I've finally said everything I needed to say. When the speeches were over and the crowd thinned, Nora helped me move the painting into a pool of light near the window. The surface glowed faintly under the lamplight. "Do you ever miss him?" she asked quietly. "Every day," I said, "but not the way I used to." Samuel had been gone for 20 years, but tonight, he felt near, woven into every brushstroke. Long ago he'd told me, if art doesn't make us kinder, then all we've learned from it is how to decorate our pride. I didn't understand it then. I do now. When everyone left, I sat alone on the wooden bench facing the painting. The air smelled of oil and dust and memory. I could still hear the faint echo of applause from earlier years, the kind that once meant everything, and now meant nothing. I took a small knife from my pocket and gently loosened the edge of the canvas, just enough to slip my hand behind it. My fingers brushed paper. The letter I had placed there months before. It was Samuel's handwriting. He had written it the year before he died, hidden among his sketches. I never showed it to anyone, until now. It began with his usual grace. "To those who teach others to see." I read it softly under my breath. If art doesn't help us become better human beings, every color we use loses its meaning. Paint not what your eyes see, but what your heart refuses to ignore. And when your students surpass you, don't mourn it. Rejoice. It means the light you carried found another home. My vision blurred before I reached the end. He had left that letter for me, but also for Celia, and for anyone who would come after. I placed it back carefully, smoothing the edges of the canvas. The brushstrokes above it now seemed to pulse with life, as if the words themselves had blended into the paint. For years I thought justice was something we earn. But maybe it's something we leave behind, like a quiet instruction for those still learning how to see. As I stood, I noticed a little girl near the doorway staring up at the painting. Her mother whispered, "Do you like it?" The girl nodded. "Feels kind," she said. That was enough. When the lights dimmed and the hall emptied, I stayed a while longer. Outside, the moonlight reflected on the lake beyond the windows. The same lake where Samuel once taught me how to catch the morning light in watercolor. I whispered into the silence, "You were right, Samuel. Kindness is the only color that never fades." Then I turned off the last lamp and walked toward the door. The canvas glowed faintly in the dark, as if the letter inside it was still speaking, not to me, but to whoever would one day need to hear it. When the exhibition doors opened that morning, I didn't expect the silence. Not the uneasy kind, but the kind that feels like reverence. People moved slowly through the gallery, pausing before each painting as if afraid to break the stillness. The silent canvas hung at the center. The light from the skylight fell perfectly over it, touching the surface the way dawn touches water, soft, deliberate, forgiving. I watched from a distance. My name was printed in small letters beneath the frame, barely noticeable. It didn't matter anymore. The painting spoke louder than I ever could. A woman in her 50s stood before it, one hand over her mouth. The young student beside her whispered, "It feels like it's breathing." The woman nodded. "Feels like it understands." For years I had painted to be understood. But that morning, I realized understanding doesn't come from words or explanations. It comes from quiet recognition, when the truth no longer needs to defend itself. Reporters were there too, but none of them asked about the scandal anymore. Instead, they wrote down small phrases, their pens moving slower than usual, as if they didn't want to miss the calm that filled the room. Nora approached me, her eyes shining. "They're crying, Marianne," she whispered. I turned toward the crowd. It was true. People wiped their eyes not from sadness, but from something deeper, relief maybe. One man knelt down in front of the painting, his notebook forgotten at his side. Later I would learn he was an art critic from New York. His article appeared the next week. It began with just one line. Marianne Cole's justice needed no law, only the quiet honesty of a human heart. That sentence spread farther than I ever imagined. It was quoted in journals, shared in art schools, even discussed in classrooms where young painters debated what it meant to be true. But I didn't need to read any of that to know something had shifted. I could feel it right there, in the soft hum of the gallery, the way people no longer looked for perfection but for truth. Somewhere in the back I saw Celia standing alone. She didn't come forward, didn't speak. She just looked at the painting for a long time. Then very gently she bowed her head. That was enough. When the exhibition ended, the crowd stayed longer than usual. No one wanted to leave. And for the first time I didn't rush to pack up my things. I just sat quietly, watching the reflections move across the glass. I thought about Samuel, about the day he told me, "One day the art will outgrow you. That's when you'll know you've done something right." I used to fear that moment. Now I understood. The painting was no longer mine. It belonged to everyone who needed it. Days later I passed by the gallery again. Through the window I saw a group of children pointing at the canvas. Their teacher said, "This one's about forgiveness." One of the kids asked, "How can paint forgive?" The teacher smiled. "It can't, but people can." I walked away then, slowly, smiling to myself. Sometimes I think art doesn't just hang on walls, it hangs inside people. In their choices, in their quiet moments, in the way they treat others when no one is watching. That's what the silent canvas became. Not a story about betrayal or even redemption, but about how truth, once revealed, doesn't demand attention. It simply waits to be recognized. And as I watched the lake shimmer later that evening, I realized something else. All my life I have been painting light. But what truly mattered was learning how to be light, gentle, steady, and silent enough for others to see themselves in it. After the exhibition, something quiet but powerful began to move through Lakeshire. It wasn't noise or headlines this time. It was the sound of brushes scratching softly against canvas. The town had changed. You could feel it in the way people looked at one another, less judgment, more patience. The art school that once stood empty reopened its doors. Only this time it wasn't a school for fame or competition. It was for the children. Every Saturday morning you could see them by the lake. Tiny easels scattered under the willow trees, jars of water reflecting the sunlight. Their laughter carried over the ripples, mixing with the rustle of reeds. The sign at the entrance read, "Free art lessons sponsored by the Lakeshore community." And at the far end of the dock stood Celia. She wasn't the star of any exhibition now. She was the assistant. Sometimes she guided a child's trembling hand. Sometimes she simply watched, quiet, humble, learning how to teach without pride. One afternoon I walked by and stopped behind her. The lake shimmered just as it always had, but it felt different, cleaner, somehow lighter. "Do they know who you are?" I asked softly. She smiled without looking up. "They just call me Miss C." Then she turned, meeting my eyes for a brief moment. "That's enough." It was. Later, Nora came carrying coffee for the volunteers. She sat beside me, watching Celia help a small boy who was painting the sky green. "She could have left," Nora said. "Most people would have run from this place." I nodded. "Running doesn't wash anything away. You have to face what you stained." That day the townspeople gathered around to thank me for inspiring the classes. But the truth was I hadn't done anything. Lakeshire had healed itself. All I did was plant a seed, quietly, and the town decided to grow a garden. A young journalist came by to interview me. He was barely older than the students. He asked, "Do you think people can really change?" I looked at the lake again. Celia was laughing with the children, her hands streaked with paint. "Yes," I said. "When they stop trying to be remembered and start trying to be useful." He wrote that down word for word. It made me smile. People always love simple answers. But the truth behind them isn't simple at all. Change doesn't come from apologies. It comes from repeated kindness, small consistent acts that no one claps for. As the sun lowered, the children lined up their paintings along the fence. One of them, a little girl with freckles, held up her work for me to see. It was a picture of two women standing by the lake, holding the same brush. She said, "I wanted to paint what forgiveness looks like." I almost couldn't speak. That evening, I walked home through the narrow streets. The shop windows glowed with warm light. In the cafe, Nora had displayed one of the children's paintings right by the door. Underneath it, she had written in chalk, "No one truly loses their name if they learn how to earn it back." Stopped me in my tracks. Because that was it, the heart of everything. We all fall short. We all betray, misunderstand, forget. But redemption doesn't erase the past. It redeems it, brushstroke by brushstroke. The next morning, Celia brought me a bouquet of wildflowers tied with a ribbon made from her old gallery apron. She said, "For every time I sign where I shouldn't have." I just smiled and placed them in a glass jar by my window. When the wind came from the lake, the petals trembled like small whispers, reminders that silence, when chosen, can teach louder than anger ever will. Lakeshore didn't become famous after all this, but it became something better, a place where people painted to remember goodness, not success. And as I watched those children every week, I realized this was Samuel's legacy too. Not in museums or galleries, but here, in the laughter by the lake, in the colors that refused to fade, and in the people who finally learned that art, like forgiveness, is most powerful when it belongs to everyone. The morning she came to say goodbye was quiet, wrapped in the kind of mist that makes every sound softer. Celia stood at my gate, her suitcase beside her, a scarf tucked around her neck, the same scarf she used to wear when she was my student. I poured us tea the way Samuel used to, 2 cups, 1 sugar each. We sat by the window overlooking the lake. The water was calm, like it was holding its breath for us. She looked around the studio at the half-finished sketches, at the broken brush I'd kept in a jar. "I never noticed how small this room was," she said. "It was never small," I replied. "It only felt smaller when we tried to fit our egos inside it." She smiled faintly, then looked down at her hands. "I'm leaving for the city tomorrow. There's a new program for young artists. They asked me to help." Her voice trembled. Feels strange. Helping others after everything I've done. I shook my head. That's the only kind of help that matters. The one that comes after understanding. We sat in silence for a while. The clock ticked. The light shifted across the floorboards. Then she asked, almost in a whisper, if you hadn't stayed silent back then, if you just told me straight, do you think I would have understood sooner? I turned to her, meeting her eyes. No one hears the truth when their heart is still loud. She blinked, trying to hold back tears. Then I was deaf for a long time. You were, I said softly. But that's part of learning. Even silence teaches if we're willing to listen. She leaned back in the chair, breathing out slowly. I used to think silence was weakness. Now I know it's what keeps anger from turning us cruel. Outside, the children's laughter carried from the lakeshore where the weekend art class had gathered. Celia turned to look through the window. They're painting the water again, she said. It's all blue. I smiled. It always starts with blue. But wait until they discover how many colors hide inside it. She nodded, eyes following the children. You know, when they ask me what art means, I still don't have an answer. Then tell them the truth, I said. That art isn't an answer. It's a mirror. It shows us who we are when we stop pretending. For a moment she looked like the girl I once taught. Eager, restless, full of wonder. But this time there was something gentler behind her eyes. She reached into her coat pocket and took out a folded letter. I wrote this last night, she said. It's for you. Don't read it now. Maybe when you need to remember that what you did mattered. I took it, feeling the weight of her words more than the paper itself. Thank you, I said simply. When she stood, I followed her to the door. At the threshold, she hesitated. I don't know if I can ever repay you. You already have, I said. You stayed long enough to understand. She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. Goodbye, Marianne. As she walked down the path, the fog began to lift. The sunlight caught her hair for a moment, turning it gold, the same shade I used to mix for the morning light in my paintings. I watched until she disappeared around the bend, then went back inside. The letter sat on the table between our empty teacups. I didn't open it. Not yet. Some words, like colors, need time to dry before they reveal their truth. I looked toward the lake again, where the children's laughter still echoed. The world felt lighter, somehow like forgiveness had become part of the air itself. And as I cleaned the brushes and covered the easels, I thought about what Samuel once told me. We don't pass down art. We pass down the way we see. Maybe that was what today was about. Not an ending, but the quiet passing of sight, from one heart finally calm to another finally open. A year after our last conversation by the lake, the world had begun to call Celia's name again, but this time for a different reason. I read about it in a small magazine feature. The Light of Integrity Foundation, the vision for honest art. There was her picture, standing on a stage not for applause, but to hand a scholarship to a trembling young painter. Behind her a banner read, "For those who create truth, not noise." She had used her inheritance, her savings, and what was left of her reputation to build something new. The foundation for artists who wanted to paint without compromise, to live without pretense. The world noticed. Slowly, the same critics who once tore her apart began to write about redemption, about light returning to its source. But I stayed here in Lakeshire, where the morning still began with mist, and the lake still reflected more than it revealed. One afternoon, the courier arrived at my door with a sealed envelope. Inside was an invitation embossed with gold lettering. Opening Gala, the Light of Integrity. And below it, in her handwriting, "For you, Marianne, the one who taught me that silence can be louder than fame." I traced her words with my thumb, smiling. Then I folded the paper back and slipped it into my sketchbook. I didn't go. That night I wrote her a letter instead. It was short, just one line. Justice doesn't need a name carved in stone, only a hand that carries the torch forward. The next morning I mailed it and went for a walk by the lake. The children were still there, painting on their small canvases, faces streaked with color. One of them waved and shouted, "Mrs. Cole, look! I painted the light like you said." I walked over, looked at the little canvas and laughed softly. The sun, the lake, the horizon, all blurring together in a wash of gentle yellows. He had captured it perfectly. Not the light itself, but the feeling of it. "Keep that," I told him. "That's yours." As I walked home, I thought about how strange it was, how something as fragile as light could outlive all of us. It didn't belong to me or to Celia or to Samuel. It belonged to whoever saw it and decided to pass it on. Weeks later, the parcel arrived from the city. Inside was a photograph of the gala. Celia stood under the stage lights, holding a small glass orb engraved with Samuel's name. She looked older, calmer, grounded in a way I once prayed she'd become. There was a note attached. "I didn't speak tonight. I just let his name shine. Thank you for teaching me how." I placed that photo beside the old brush jar on my desk. The broken brush still rested there. Its handle cracked, its bristles stiff. But now it didn't look like a relic. It looked like proof that even broken tools can leave a legacy of creation. That evening I opened the window. The last light of the day spilled across my table, warm and soft, touching the old canvases, the photographs, the memories. It wasn't the light of winter anymore. It was gentler, earned, not borrowed. Sometimes I think about how justice was never what I sought. What I wanted was clarity. And I found it. Not in recognition, not in victory, but in knowing that the truth I carried had found its next keeper. So I leave the studio door open now. Sometimes young artists visit, curious about the old woman who once painted the silent canvas. They expect stories about betrayal or triumph, but I only tell them this. Art is just the body. Integrity is its soul. One fades, the other glows. Then I let them paint, and I watch their faces as the light hits their work. Because that, I've learned, is the only immortality that matters. To see your light reflected in someone else's hands, and to know it will keep burning long after you've gone. If you've ever had something taken from you, your work, your love, your trust, you know that silence can burn louder than shouting. I've learned that there are two kinds of victories. The one the world can see, and the one that lives quietly inside your chest. The first fades. The second changes who you are. When they steal your idea, don't rush to expose them. When they mock your kindness, don't rush to harden yourself. And when they twist your light into their own, don't try to dim it. Just keep shining. Because time has a strange way of polishing the truth until it glows again. I used to think justice was a loud thing, people clapping, cameras flashing, and apology said out loud. But it isn't. Justice happens in the quiet. When guilt becomes reflection, when pride turns to humility, and when someone finally understands the pain they once caused. So if someone ever takes what you built, remember this: they can borrow your work, your ideas, even your name. But they can't borrow your peace. That belongs to you alone. The world often measures success by who gets the credit. But real integrity, it's measured by who keeps creating, even when no one is watching. That's where dignity lives, in the space between loss and forgiveness. If you've been betrayed, don't let bitterness paint your heart. Wait, let time dry the colors. Because only then will you see what the picture really means. Some people chase revenge because they think it will restore balance. But revenge is just another theft. It steals the peace you already earned. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing to move forward without dragging the weight behind you. So to anyone watching this right now, if someone ever took your idea, your love, or your effort, remember, time and truth are already working on your behalf. You don't have to shout. You just have to keep going. And when the world finally catches up, you'll realize something simple but profound. The best kind of justice is the kind that doesn't need an audience. Because truth, like light, doesn't need to make noise to be seen. Thank you for listening to The Silent Canvas. If this story touched you, share it with someone who's still waiting for their truth to be seen. And tell me, Where are you watching from tonight? With love and with quiet strength, remember, justice needs no noise.